Okay, so we're going to start to refactor our application a little bit. We're going to move our context functions into an actions folder, and we're going to call those from the component and dispatch to our reducer from the component as well. So let's go into our GitHub context. And the first thing we can do is these 4 lines right here. Since we're just passing users and then state.users, instead of doing this, we can just pass all of the whole state directly, and we can do that with the spread operator. So we want to spread across all the state values. So that will, save us a couple lines of code. If we save that, everything still should work the exact same. Okay, good. Now, these are the functions that I want to get rid of. The only thing that I want to pass down through the provider is the state and dispatch, because remember up here, from use reducer, we get this dispatch, and what we've been doing is just dispatching directly from these functions within our context. But like I said, I want to dispatch from the component, so let's pass down dispatch, okay? And ultimately, these will be the only 2 things that we pass down. We're going to get rid of these. So let's start with search users. So like I said, we're going to move that to an actions file. So in the GitHub folder in context, let's create a new file and let's call it GitHub Actions.js. And we're going to need access to the GitHub URL and our token. So let's copy these 2 lines right here. Ultimately, we'll get rid of these, but for now, we'll just copy. And then the search users, I'm going to grab that. So this whole search users function. And let's actually go ahead and cut that and paste that in here. Now, the actions, they're not going to call set loading because we're going to dispatch loading from the component right before we call the action. And then down here, instead of dispatching, since we're doing that from the component, all we want to do here is return the data. So we're going to return items. And we also want to make sure we export this so that we can call it from the component. So we want to make sure you add export to all of your functions here. So let's save that. And then let's go into our user search, because that's where we're actually going to be using this. And we want to bring that action in. So let's say import, and we want to use curly braces because this is not a default export. So search users, and we're going to bring that in from, let's go up 2 levels into context, into GitHub, and then into, we want GitHub Actions. And then let's go down here. So before we were bringing it in from the context right here, we can get rid of that. And then down where we were calling right here, calling search users, we still want to call search users, but we're going to put this into a variable because remember, it returns the data. So we're going to set users to, and then we need to await here. And since we're using await, this handle submit needs to be asynchronous. All right, so this will get the users. Then all we want to do is dispatch. Oops, I want to say dispatch. And in here, we're going to dispatch the action with the type of search underscore users. No, actually, it's get users, right? Let's take a look in our reducer. Let's see. Yep, so we want this get users. And basically send as a payload, we want to send the users, just like we were doing from the context. So type is going to be get users, and then the payload is going to be users. Now we also want to set the loading state right before. So let's go right here and let's dispatch. And from here we want to dispatch an object and set the type and set that to a string of set loading. All right, now dispatch, remember we passed into the value in the context, so we should be able to get it from the context. So I'm going to go right here and pass in dispatch. And the reason we can get that is because remember, down here in the value, we passed it in dispatch. So let's save that. Let's save all of this. Okay, so yeah, that should now work. Let's try it out. So we'll go ahead and try to search. Let's see, unhandled rejection dispatch is not a function. So dispatch is not a function. We're taking it from the, did I not save this? Oh, I didn't save that. Search users is not defined. Oh, so in the context, we're still passing search users, but I deleted it from the context, so we want to get rid of that. Okay, so let's try it now. And there we go. So search users is working, except now it's not being passed down through the provider, through the context provider. It's just stored in an actions file, and in our component, we're calling that action, and then we're dispatching the action to the reducer, passing the payload, and updating the user state. So that should be all set, the user search. We can close that up. And in the next video, we want to take the get user and get user repos, and we want to move those to the action file as well. And then we want to dispatch from our component. All right, guys, so now we want to move our get user, which is our single user, and the user repos to the GitHub Actions file. So let's grab both of these. And later on, we're actually going to turn this into one function instead of two. But for now, let's grab both of these. Let's cut those, and let's bring those into our actions. So paste those in, and let's make sure that we export. So we want to export const get user and export const get user repos. Okay, and let's see, set loading is not defined. So yeah, we're not going to call set loading here. And let's see, we also want to just return. Instead of dispatching, we're going to return the data. Okay, and just clean that up. And then under get user repos, again, not calling set loading, and we're going to return the data from here as well. And then since we move these to the actions file, we no longer need to pass down here. We no longer need to pass either of these functions through the provider. Also, we're not calling set loading anymore, so we can actually get rid of this. And clear users, we can actually, yeah, we'll get rid of that because we're going to dispatch right from the user search to clear the user. So we can get rid of that and clear it up from here. And then we no longer need these because the only place we're using them is in the actions file. So this got cleaned up quite well. So it's basically just our state. And then we're only passing down our state and then dispatch to use from components. So let's save that. Before we implement the get user and get user repos, let's do the clear, because right now, if I try to clear, it's not going to work. So back in our user search, so let's see, from our GitHub context, we don't want to bring in clear users. We got rid of that. And then down where we're calling clear users, which is, where is it? Down here. Yeah, so we're calling it right here. Instead of calling it directly, we're going to have a function, and we're just going to call dispatch, and we're going to dispatch the type, which is going to be clear underscore users. Okay, so that'll dispatch that action to the reducer, and then in the reducer, it will just empty the user state. So if I click that, there, they should go away. All right, so let's close up user search. Let's go back into, or let's go into our user page, because that's where we're going to use these actions. If I search for a user right now and I go to the profile, it's not going to work because it doesn't know what get user is. So let's go to, where is it? Pages, and then user. And let's close up the sidebar here. So we have two actions that we need to bring in. So let's bring in get user, and let's bring in get user repos. That's going to be from // context / GitHub / GitHub actions. All right, and then what we're getting from the context, remember get user is no longer being passed down, so we don't want that. We also don't want get user repos. So all we're getting is the state values of user, loading, and repos. And then down here where we have our use effect, and we're not just going to call get user and get user repos, which before dispatched right from the function. Now let's get rid of that. We want to basically just get the user data from those actions. Now I'm going to use async await, and when we use use effect, we can't do this, async, and then do some kind of await down here. We can't do it like that. So we need to create a new function here. So I'll call this get user data, and we'll set that to async so that we can use async await. And then we'll just call that down here, get user data. And before we get the user data, I want to set the loading state. So let's dispatch, which I don't think I didn't bring that in. So that we want to bring in from our context. So bring in dispatch, and we're going to dispatch the action with a type of set_loading. All right, and then inside get user data, let's create a variable here. I'll just call it user data. And then we want to await get user and pass in our params.login, so whatever's in the URL. And then we want to dispatch from here. We want to dispatch an object, and the type is going to be a string of get user. And then we want to pass the payload, which is going to be the user data. Okay, so that takes care of the user. Now we want to do the repos. So I'm just going to actually copy that, and we'll call this user repo data. And instead of get user, it's going to be get user repos. And then when we dispatch, we'll dispatch get repos. And the payload for that will be the response above, which is get repo data. Now, in the next video, I want to refactor this again so that we don't have to do two separate calls here, two separate functions, and two separate dispatches. We can actually merge them, but for now, we'll just do it this way. And let's save that. And now this is working again. So we're just calling our actions and making our dispatches from the component. Now we will get some warnings about dependencies. Let's just reload this. Yep, so missing dependencies, dispatch, and params.login, because we use those within the use effect. Now it's fine to add these as dependencies. So dispatch and params.login. So we can add those, and if we reload, we shouldn't get that warning anymore. And this is fine because these things aren't constantly changing like before when we had our context functions that got recreated every time the state changed. So we can pass these in as dependencies. So in the next video, what I want to do is clean up this actions file, because right now we have, for one, we have two separate functions to get the user and repos. We can combine those. And then I'm going to actually install Axios, which is an HTTP client, and use that instead of fetch, because it allows us to basically create an instance where we can just add headers once instead of having to add it here, instead of having to add them all separately. So Axios will allow us to clean this up quite a bit. All right, guys, so now we're going to clean up our actions file a little bit, and I'm going to be using Axios instead of the fetch API to make our requests. So down here, I'm going to just open up a new terminal, and I'm going to npm install Axios. And this is completely optional. Pretty much this whole section is optional because there's, like I said, there's so many different ways to do things, but we can clean this up quite a bit. So let's go ahead, and in our actions, we're going to go to the top here, and let's import Axios from Axios. And now what I want to do is create an instance of Axios that we can use, and we can call this whatever we want. I'm going to call it GitHub, and then we can do axios.create, and pass in an object here, and we want to set the base URL, which is going to be set to our GitHub underscore URL. And then we can also set the headers here for any requests that we make with this instance, which is really cool. So we're going to set the authorization. Actually, I can just copy from one of these down here. Just want to set that. Whoops. Okay, so now we can then do, you know, github.get or github.post, whatever type of request we want to make. So in the search results here, let's see, we still want the params. I'm just gonna, yeah, we'll just get rid of that. So we want the params, and then let's do const response and set that to await. And then we can use github.get. So that's going to make a get request using that Axios instance. And in here it's going to be /search/users. And then we want to add our params. So we want to do question mark and then params. And with Axios, you don't have to do, you know, await res.json like you do with the fetch API. This will just give us the response, including the JSON data. It's going to be in an object called data. So what we want to return from here is going to be response.data, and then remember there's an items array in the data. So that's what we want to return from here. Now, for the user search, or I'm sorry, get user and get user repos, I'm actually going to get rid of those because we're going to have one single function that gets both. So we're really going to clean this up. Let's say get user and repos, and we want to export our function, and we'll call this get user and repos and set that to async. And this is, remember, this takes in the login. And then what we can do here, since we're making two requests, remember we're making it to /user/login, and then also /user/login/repos. So to make two requests, we can actually use promise.all and basically pass in an array of requests. So to do that, we're going to say const, and we're going to, in brackets, we'll have user and repos. And then the way this works is we do await promise.all, and this then takes in an array of requests. So our first request will be github.get, and in here it's going to be /users/ and then the login. Okay, so that's going to be the first request, and then we'll put a comma here, and the next one is going to be github.get, and this is going to be to /users/ and then we want the login, and then we want /repos, like that. All right, and then we'll go underneath those requests, and what we want to return from here is an object with a user, and that's going to be set to user.data, and then we want the repos, which is going to be set to repos.data. All right, so we're going to get the user and the repos from these requests from this one function. So let's now save that, and this is going to break right now because get user is gone and it's looking for get user. So let's go into our user.jsx, and there's not much we're going to have to change here. We just want to go into our use effect right here, and instead of making two requests, let's go ahead and just make one, and we'll still call this user data, but instead of get user, it's going to be get user and repos, which we do have to bring in. So up here, instead of bringing in both of these, get user and repos, we're going to bring that in from the actions. Okay, so we make that, we call that function, pass the login, and then for dispatch, instead of get user, let's do get user and underscore repos, and then the payload is going to be the user data. Now we don't have this in our reducer, so let's open that up. Go to our GitHub reducer, and from here we no longer need two separate get user, get repos. So I'll actually delete this one, and let's rename this. Oops, let's rename that to get user and repos. And then the payload that we're passing in should have a user and a repos object. So for the user, we're going to set that to action payload user. And then we also want the repos, and that part of the state that we're setting is the repos. And loading false. All right, so we'll save that, and now we should get the user and the repos. And just to kind of test everything, let's search, let's click on one of these, and there we go. So it's getting the user data and the repos. So this actions file is now, really cleaned up. So like I said before, I mean, in React, there's a lot of different ways to do the same thing, and everybody has their preference. So you might watch tutorials and read articles where they do things in a completely different way, and that's just something you're going to have to learn to kind of navigate as a React developer. But I wanted to refactor because I think this is a better way of doing things, and I also wanted you to get a better idea of just what exactly is going on when we dispatch actions to our reducer, and then it updates the state and it passes those state values down into our component. So hopefully that whole process is clear to you now. All right, but that's it for this project. I may add something onto it. I may add a little bit of extra functionality later on, but that's going to be it for now. All right, guys, so Vercel is another great place to host your React websites or React applications, and in no way is Vercel or any other company sponsoring this course. These are platforms that I personally use and recommend. So we're going to go ahead and deploy our GitHub Finder app to Vercel, and it's very simple. Basically, all you need to do is push your app to GitHub. You can say I have this GitHub Finder app, and then just go ahead and register at Vercel, and you can use GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, or email. I use GitHub, so I'm going to click that, and then you'll see your project page, and you can click on New Project, and from here you want to find your GitHub repo. So I'm just going to search for it, this one right here, GitHub Finder app. I'm going to click Import, and then you're going to see this form. So you have your project name, your framework preset, which is for us is going to be Create React App. And then we do have a couple environment variables that we need to add. So back in my text editor, if we go to .env, remember we have this React app GitHub URL. So I'm just going to grab that value. And then for the name here, React app GitHub URL. And then we want to paste that in here and click Add. And then we also want to do React app, and what was the other one? So React app GitHub token, and I'm going to just grab that. So GitHub _ token, and then we'll go ahead and paste that in. All right, so we'll click Add, and then we should be all set to deploy. And this might just take a couple minutes. Okay, so once that's done, we'll see in our dashboard our application, and we should be able to just go visit. Okay, and we'll just test it out. We'll search for Brad, and there we go. So our app is now deployed. So very, very simple. And Vercel is also great for like Next.js and Vue.js and all that. But yeah, so this is all working correctly. Our routes are working. Now the domain obviously isn't very pretty, so you can add a custom domain if you want. I'm not going to go through that. You can just follow the instructions. It's pretty easy. But yeah, so that's it for this project, and let's move on to the next one.